Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb. The Thinking Fellows is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcast to see all of our episodes there. Today, I am joined by my father, Dr. Scott Keith, and by Dr. Adam Francisco to continue our Why You Should series. A little heads up to the listeners, we are all three recording by Zoom, which is not something we do very often. So if there's some technical hiccups, that is why. But we'll try to smooth out as many of those as we can. Today we're going to continue with sort of these fun topics, I suppose, because Adam came up with this one immediately after some of the ideas that came out of our Why You Should Care About the World Wars episode. And so we're going to do Why You Should Be Aware of Secularism. And the thing with this is there is a lot of talk about secularism, living in a secular age, living in secular spaces, and even as we record this, the Queen of England died yesterday, and I was seeing people talk about that as sort of the hallmark bookend of the definitive end of any sort of Christendom.
Yeah, the last vestige of Christendom
Right.
is gone.
Comes to an end. And so this is perhaps very timely because we've been living with secularism for a long time, and now sort of the final symbol of a Christian age is gone. And so that's definitely interesting. Adam, this was your idea, so I'm going to hit you with the heavy question, which is, I think secularism, when this is posed in other podcasts or formats that I've heard, doesn't get defined clearly enough. It's just kind of assumed that everybody knows we're talking about just the non-religious or something like that. So can you go ahead and just outline what we will deal with as the definition of secularism on this show?
Yeah, well, that's a $1 million question, and like you said, there's just a ton of conversation, scholarly and popular, around the theme of secularism, secularization, and so on. Secularism, I would, and maybe for the show, we'll just stick with this definition, is not just some acknowledgement that there's temporal space that is at least hypothetically neutral, free of the infringement of religion or theology or something like that, but rather secularism is an actual, like you call it, an ideology or a worldview that says there is no room ever for anything from God or theology or revelation. Secularism, I would say, is not necessarily like a Richard Dawkins type of atheism, but it's tantamount, very, very similar to an atheism. The big scholarly tome on this, though there are lots, but the most celebrated one is by Charles Taylor. It's called Our Secular Age, and I don't remember the page count, but it's an enormous book. I think over the course of like 10 years, I tried to start it and finish it maybe 5 different times. I finally did finish it. It's a complicated book, but what Taylor argues is he starts off by posing the question, something like, why is it that 500 years ago, around the time of like Martin Luther, nobody could have envisioned engaging in politics, moral thinking, everyday life without some sort of reference or anchor to the divine? Why is it now, from 500 years later, we find it so difficult to connect the things in our public space to theology or to the divine? And the short answer is, well, we've slowly but surely, and his account is very different than sort of the 30,000-foot view that you'll get from sociology. But through a very long process, we've slowly but surely changed our view of the world, maybe not willingly, oftentimes not willingly, such that for us, all the stuff that really counts is that which is imminent, that which is in time and space. And life should be ordered around the temporal, finite things.
So
Yep, go ahead.
my question, and maybe even just a slight, I don't know if it's a disagreement, but like footnote is that, and with this is that this borderline is a synonym for materialism almost, but it doesn't, it appears to me that secularism has gotten past materialism, especially with a lot of the personal identity um, questions, the sexual
Mhm,
orientation, transgender
mhm.
um, questions, is that it's not just materialism anymore, that it's sort of transcended the physical.
Yeah, you could. Did we mention last time we talked, or over the last podcast, Carl Truman's book, A Strange New World?
I did, and I put it in the show notes of of 2 episodes ago.
Okay, in his work, the work from which that abridged version comes, the rise or the yeah, the rise and triumph of the modern self, he effectively argues that in this sort of secular space, as it because nature abhors a vacuum, there really is no neutral space.
Mm.
You know, we try to in civil society at least politely pretend there's some sort of neutrality, but really, when the rubber hits the road, there isn't neutrality. And so, when we pretend, and at least the side that once dominated gives up ground to, or gives up, pulls back from this public, civil, temporal space, immediately there are ideologies that come to fill it, and we could just call that, basically kind of the secularism. And but in within this secularist arena, all sorts of thinkers and ideologies begin to emerge that lead to this triumph of the self, where every individual is effectively creates a world and an identity for themselves. It's no longer that the individual tries to conform to the will of God or to the will of nature or the order of nature, but now we all determine just what nature is individually. So to be sure, like you suggested from your question, secularism is no longer like the atheism that you and I think of, like Richard Dawkins or Anthony Flew back in the 20th century before he abandoned atheism. But it's now, um, it's almost like, practically speaking, it's anything but a theistic worldview.
Do you see maybe that uh, it's like an accelerated history of um, Roman Catholicism to Protestantism, where there was sort of a scientific community, a priesthood that had access to this groundbreaking worldview that brings in secularism, kills God, and once that becomes popular and is in the popular language, it becomes an infinite sort of number of secular churches and people based on sort of what tenets are most important to them.
Yeah, I think in short, yes. um, I think also, if you so let's say there's this, we pretend that there's this neutral secular space, um, and we as Christians sort of sit aloof of it. People by nature have this sort of natural disposition to grope after, to find something higher. If they're not allowed, if Christianity is not allowed to be that something higher, they're going to find something else. And I would argue that that's what just explains the rise of in popularity of ideology, is that people need something higher than just sort of like the horizontal plane. They need something to order their life around, whether it be kind of wokest type of stuff. I don't know if wokest is a real term, but if it isn't, I'm the one who coined it right here now.
If
Um,
somebody else sells T-shirts, you know, Adam.
um, or some sort of new agey thing, whatever it might be. That's the way I see it. I'd be curious to. I said this in an email last night that I sent to your dad about a totally different topic, but I'm curious to hear what he thinks about this.
I think
Because
there's a point at which you can see, you know, this arc of history, and I think we have to be careful here because we oftentimes take our own experience, sort of living in the last vestiges of what we called at the beginning Christendom. Um, and we can certainly say, maybe even the last vestiges of this, the West, that uh, we think we can sort of take our experience with God, and especially in our circumstance, the three of us being Christians, and the fact that we really do, a lot of the explanations about life and morality and everyday stuff have to do with the reality that God has given and ordained all things. And so we're influenced by that a lot. But human history um, isn't, it's maybe not as sort of influenced by Christendom as we think. If you look at the whole of history, you're looking at really the last 2,000 years in the West. But because that's our experience, that we sort of latch on to that.
And
I
don't you
think if you look,
think not only like our personal experience, but in a lot of cases, the space where the traditions and rules and laws that formed our society originally were forged, even if they weren't all Christian laws or the
no, they
such?
were. That's my point. If you look, before that, um, and before the coming of Christ, you have sort of a mix of paganism, animism.
I mean, it's kind of like we're going
It,
backwards, right? I mean, a lot of the
yeah,
stuff
I
we deal
mean,
with today
you
is,
have you have lots of different options before the Christian West. Some, some worked, some didn't work. Some were uh, incredibly synchronistic, and some were a little more channeled. But the reality is that the world that we live in, no matter where you live in this world, is dramatically influenced by the what we would say, progress, especially scientific and technological progress of the West, as the West is living in its last years of Christendom and Christian influence. And so we can look at it and we can see, maybe you want to start with Martin Luther and the Reformation. Like I don't remember if it was off tape or on tape last week. I said some people attributed it even to Martin Luther translating the Bible into German and the popularity of that German Bible. And now all sorts of people get to have different opinions about particular theological topics that they wouldn't have been really asked their opinion on before. In that way, sort of the self is made the arbiter. And once the self is made the arbiter, you can really trace this sort of progression away from deferring to God, even if it's through a priest, um, to deferring to self for all things. And the further and further away you get to the deferring from God, kind of where we are now, now you have to start, actually, we've come all the way over the hump of the bell curve and we're on the other side. And you have to start looking for other things to defer to, because you actually can't know about everything like you thought you could, especially in an age where there's so much information. One of the problems with our age is there's so much information available, you can't consume it all, um, and understand it all, and process it all. And so now we're on the other side, and you get this part of secularism that you sort of get deferrals to experts, which is now being called expertism. You get this deferral to science, which is called scientism. You get the deferral to an ethic called woke, which Adam coined wokeism. Um, you know,
Wokest.
a wokist,
There
sorry.
is the wokeism word out there. Wokest,
Okay.
though.
Yeah. And so you have all of these deferrals, and they are in a way reaching up, right? That's the classic human disease when it comes to God, is to reach up rather than acknowledging his reaching down. They're all
Mhm.
reaching up, to try to grab hold of the one that is the super authority that can kind of be claimed over all things. And we see that. And I think that's what you have going on in secularism. But in a lot of ways, it's a kind of going back to before there was this sort of one unified powerhouse of Christendom
Mm.
that eventually influenced things in the whole world, by means of their science and the technology that kind of spread everywhere, and thus then the information that spread everywhere. You're on the you're on the downslope of that for sure. And I think people don't know how to adjust away from it. You have, it's so it's so funny in a way, but just so bizarre and sad too, that how Adam started this is that in the past it was very normal to look for explanations for things, and to look to God for those explanations. And now you're actually kind of an oddball if you take, and the further you take that, the more of an oddball you are. Um, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That, I don't know how long what you just said lasted, but there's just a lot of juicy stuff there. One thing I was initially thinking is, I forget how you put it, but we're on the tail end of, I think, to be honest, we're past it, but there are still some vestiges of Christendom hanging around. And I think Christians, back to like the original question, why should we should be aware of secularism? I think we really need, Christians generally really need to get past and understand that we do not live in Christendom. America is not a
Oh,
Christian nation.
we did a whole show on that, and I think people should go listen to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm not like, offering up a toast to that or anything like that, but if once you realize that we never really have been a Christian nation in a legal political sense, that's actually
Even in
prohibited by the First Amendment.
I mean, in a
But
cultural sense, like church attendance in the United States has always been abysmal compared to maybe not Europe today, but
right,
historically, right? And stuff
yeah,
like that.
but historically, I mean, I think there was always at least deference or respect for the church, broadly conceived, and like you suggested, Caleb, the West, in many ways, certainly before, let's say, the Enlightenment, so early 17th century or mid 17th century, was shaped by a version or versions of Christianity. And then the Enlightenment comes around, and the West is, there was this sort of Enlightenment principles are fused with Christian principles. Those sort of vestiges or artifacts still
Kind of like
stick are still
Elizabethan
around.
England, right? It's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Enlightenment principles, or not Victorian England. Sorry, Victorian England. Enlightenment principles fused with sort of Christian
Yeah,
principles.
yeah, and I mean, looking at it with hindsight, there's something beautiful about it. But
Well, yeah, when you're
when you're
making
looking
scientific
abstractly,
progress and you're um, thanking God for giving you the reason to help you discover some of the scientific discoveries that you've made, there's something really beautiful about that we've completely lost.
yeah.
And
Well,
when
and
it's
so
brought up, it's mocked in a funny way that it was never intended, right? So I saw somebody sort of mocking people online who had posted like, "Thank God for the recovery of my aunt from cancer," or something like that. And this person was mocking that, God didn't save that person's aunt, chemotherapy and doctors did. And what's, if you look at actual,
But who called the doctors?
yeah, like, but if you look at the sort of development of Christianity on this, the thanking God is also for creating rational creatures who value each other's lives and seek to serve each other in medical capacity, invent technologies that extend life, and stuff like that. And it's always mocked as something so far out and mystical and superstitious, where when you get down to it, it may be simply saying, God, this is the remnants of a good creation that God created that is innovative and reasonable uh, and cares for the other creature, etc.
yeah.
We should do one on why you should understand the doctrine of vocation and talk about
Mhm.
why people thank God when their family with cancer is healed, and how this has to do with the vocation of the scientist who developed the chemo or the radiation treatment, and the doctor who administered it, and the nurses who held the bedpan as they were puking from the chemo, and on and on and on.
Mhm.
And then
Right?
none of those
Yeah.
people have to be
Well,
Christians to be
No, they
objects of the good use of God.
they are the masks of God, whether they know it or not. Just like the person that delivers your food, when you say, "Give us this day our daily bread," they don't necessarily know that they're participating in God answering your prayer.
Well, yeah, or the Babylonians, conquering your people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or the Turks.
or the yeah.
Turks.
But in terms of like that original question, why should we be aware of secularism? Back to that point I made about we got to really get past this notion that we live in Christendom or a Christian nation or something like that, because you're never really going to understand where you are until you get past that. So, and like I think we talked about this on our show concerning low anthropology or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. How the stuff we see going on, even the really radical stuff in Caleb's world, the Twitterverse or whatever you guys call it. But the spectacles out there about like LGBTQIA plus stuff and all that. None of that. I mean, it should maybe appall us. Not maybe it should appall us, but it shouldn't really surprise you that people fueled by an ideology are pushing the envelope every day. Because what would hold them back? There's nothing. So everything's flattened,
Right.
in the secular arena. So
Right.
anything can go.
Yeah,
And by and large,
I think the problem is that the lie that we were sold as we were moving into secularism was a lie of understanding that we should all just sort of take the time to listen to one another
Yeah.
and understand each other's position and be okay with it. Who cares if what they do in their bedroom over there? They're not going to care what you do with your wife. Don't care what they do with whatever or whomever over here. But that was a lie. Or I don't even know if it was an intentional
And
lie.
the broader lie is that secularism was going to get rid of all sort of power structures, and that if you just lived a personal
Yeah.
life where you didn't assert power over other people,
Right.
they wouldn't assert
Well,
power over you.
If you don't proselytize me with Christianity, I won't proselytize
And
you with
when
my sexuality or whatever.
Christians on the whole were willing to lay down this external power structure, secularism actually allowed, instead of neutrality, new powers to rise up.
Yep.
And
Tolerance.
and so
Tolerance
and
was
like
a
Adam
lie.
said, there nature abhors a vacuum. When people said, okay, we'll all be equals, tyrants came in and said, no, I'm your king.
Well, but tolerance is always a lie because you're not going to change the nature of the sinful person, no matter how secular or detached from God they are.
Yeah.
They think they are.
Yeah. I mean, I would not. I'm not advocating that we all go looking to fight culture wars around every corner, at all. But I do think when we've been placed in this secular culture with all sorts of secularist ideologies, including wokeism. There's those wokeist people. I just have to throw my word out there again.
He's trying to get a TM here.
Right now,
He has to prove
website.
Yeah, he has to prove commercial use. So
I don't think it's been helpful for me to understand that in knowing that we don't live in Christian America or whatever, it helps me navigate this world without getting uptight and angry at every corner. It should not surprise us that our non-Christian neighbors don't think like Christians, which is sort of like a no-brainer.
That should not be shocking.
Yeah, but that's the thing is that I think was the church, and again, I'm not advocating culture wars, nor am I critiquing some cultural skirmishes or whatever, but sometimes when Christians face or square off with the culture, they make us all look like fools when they act like a bunch of spazzes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I would think
that, to use a technical.
Well, and it's like we said in the episode that we did on this, is that if you're fighting culture wars, quote unquote, for the sake of regaining the United States as a Christian nation, you're really on the wrong track, because you've really not understood the history of the United States, the history of Christianity, the purpose of Christianity. There's a lot of things that are being misunderstood there. That's different than saying, okay, I'm now going, did I buy the lie that if I didn't evangelize, that they wouldn't, proselytize to the point where they try to take over the entire culture and squash the real purpose of Christianity too, which is the proclamation of the gospel of Christ Jesus.
The thing I think that Christians mess up with, quote, culture war, and it gets to our vocation thing, which is, I think too often they fight it from the public perspective that they are doing it to save, serve, and protect the church, instead of doing it from the position of their civil vocations, where they say, the reason I care about these social issues is because I'm a citizen, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an employee or an employer, and these practices are harmful to my way of life, the quality of life. for me, my family, the people who depend on me, and the people I'm dependent on. And instead, they make it about doing something for Christ and the church, where the church does not demand this particular war. It is at war with the world with something different, the gospel, and where making decisions or fighting the culture or voting a particular way is about doing what you believe is best for the well-being of people here and now.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the reality. That's one of the reasons I said it's hard to do this episode without doing something on vocation too, because the the answer here is if you're going to sort of take your stand, to take your stand with Christ and the proclamation of the gospel, and then if you're going to defend those things that you've been called to defend within your particular vocations,
Yeah,
And that's enough.
and that's enough.
and I think it's
You can't save the whole world. Christ already died
already
for
did, yeah.
Mhm.
Just another thing he's stealing from you. Um, yeah, it's. I think that distinction is just difficult to make, and I think you do have to be. Vocation is one of those background things, but it's one of those ones where if we were more intentional about it and more catechetical about it, I believe you could see some of this where the church is not the location of the war for people. Maybe the civil realm is, and actually, church and the church becomes the one respite from that particular civil and social battle, where you can come to receive rest, receive forgiveness for maybe mistakes that you've made while making those rational decisions and things like that. And also hoping that it's that place where your enemy in the societal and cultural war will also eventually come to rest.
Yeah. I mean, I think that
Word.
yeah, I think we've hit a spot here where we're sort of acknowledging the fact that you need to be aware of secularism because it's already all around you, and you probably are aware of its effects on you. So maybe sort of understand a little bit of how we got here, and then understand that if you feel like you need to do something, do the things that you're actually called to do.
Mm.
Um, you know, uh, be
Yeah,
a
we need to
husband, be a
capture that.
yeah,
I wish we could do a, what do they call it, a pull quote? I think
Yeah,
what you
they
just
call them
said
pull
should be a
quotes.
pull quote.
yeah,
That's it in a nutshell.
yeah.
I think, at least from the way we approach these things. And one of the things that you said, you need to understand where it comes from. Can I ask a question? Because I think we do have some time. Is
Mm-hmm.
there are, and I think you referred to this earlier. Um, there are those mostly Catholic polemicists who will argue that secularism finds its origin in the Protestant Reformation, in particular with Luther, with the advent or his assertion of the two kingdom doctrine, and the view that we live in two kingdoms, or there's a vertical life we live before God and a horizontal life. And I mean, Luther will say things when it comes to living in the horizontal space in terms of constructing things, marrying, all these civil sort of pursuits. He'll say reason is enough in this arena. The rational man is self-sufficient in the temporal realm. And so you get these Catholic polemicists who'll say that's the initial impetus towards this pretended neutral space in which an ideology or ideologies are going to start filling. Do you ever? I don't know if this is
Sympathize with that argument.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I do actually a little bit. But at the same time, I don't think Luther's wrong, right? Because what
right.
he's doing in the two kingdoms, and back in my day, we'd call this the two kingdoms theory, right? So now this is called a two kingdoms doctrine a lot of times, and I'm okay either way on that. So don't send Caleb angry emails.
Please.
But yeah, but the reality is that he was, I think he was trying to figure out, oftentimes how the scriptures speak about this whole situation too, with the acknowledgement that God uses um, the righteous and the unrighteous alike to rule over this earth and to keep in reins the effects of sin. And if you say that it's only through the church and church's influence on government and society that this can happen, you're taking out whole parts of the world where God uses non-Christian leaders to do the same thing. And I think that this is where where in Romans 13, Paul is telling Christians to submit to Roman authority, because the Roman authorities have the power of the sword, and they use that power of sword for good. Now, you couldn't say that within sort of that trad Catholic framework that you're talking about that criticizes two kingdoms. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that it's never going to go a direction that makes us in a particular society in a direction that makes us uncomfortable or that we don't like or nostalgic for how it was before when the government itself was less secular, we think. I think what happens a lot is you get sort of anecdotal examples to try to prove that the idea itself was wrong, and the idea itself isn't wrong because I think it's really represented in Scripture. Prior to the Roman Catholic Church having its fingers in
Everything.
secular government.
And
Yeah.
honestly, in many ways, losing control during the time of Luther, not just because of Luther. I mean, a lot of uh, we've done some of this on Outlaw God in recent episodes too. A lot of the back and forth with Erasmus showed that the best thing they had for thinking they could control culture was penance, and it wasn't working. Like, anyways,
Yeah.
so
Shocker.
shocker. Like Erasmus is trying to undo the sin of his own conception as a bastard by in an institutional church that existed before he was born, maybe being stronger after he died, and it wasn't going to play out.
In all the nice ways we found to say things these days, there's not been a good way to say like illegitimate son or bastard. Both are not PC. I'm
No.
not saying it's your fault, but I'm just saying we think we would have found something for that by this point within our secular world. I haven't heard it.
I have to say, Scott, your description of the two kingdom doctrine or theory or whatever is, and it's the distinction between Luther trying to describe what he finds in the data of Scripture and the way it plays out is extremely helpful. I asked the question because I've always, like you said or suggested, I've always kind of wrestled with that because that Catholic argument makes a little sense to me, like a 30,000 foot view of things. But then, as I've been thinking about it recently, as I've been thinking about secularism, I'm thinking, wait a minute, this whole distinction of the two realms goes way back.
Yes.
To Saint Augustine, and
right.
you can really see a
city of God, city of men.
And
I mean, before, so Saint Augustine, he's late 4th, early 5th century. I think he dies 430 A.D. Go back a century earlier to Eusebius, that church historian, so early 4th century. And for example, when Emperor Constantine is coronated as emperor, the sole emperor of Rome, he writes this in praise of Constantine, and he regards, it's very clear, and I think this is the way the Eastern Orthodox still, at least in theory, views things, that the world is unitary. There are no two kingdoms or two realms. There's just one realm. And then a century later with Augustine, then you do get that distinction. And you get it from popes too. Pope Gelasius in the late 5th century in the two swords doctrine, that God has given two swords to one to the Pope, the spiritual sword, and the secular sword or the civil sword to the emperor, and so on. So those Catholic polemicists, I think they haven't done their homework. They're actually doing a polemic because they don't like Luther. And they're not actually doing history. They're not actually trying to understand the roots of secularism, because they're afraid of what they might find if they dig into their own tradition.
I mean, it's worth noting that Luther constantly noted the secularism of the church of his time.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like the Southern Renaissance is much more secular than the northern
It was like,
humanists.
it's all art and architecture.
It
What
it
are you
is,
talking
and it
about?
was, and it was more only the return to the classical world than
There
the
was some
Northern
poetry and
Renaissance,
painting.
which, the Northern Reformation does obviously go back to classical authors, but in the South it was the infatuation, and if we know anything about the
Yeah.
classical world, it is as depraved as the time we live in now in all of the
Yeah.
ways, sexual, ethical, moral. And so that's where that hotbed really took off first. Like the Reformation in Northern Europe was Christendom for another
Yeah.
until the dying. That Italian Renaissance was much more secular, I would think.
Yeah. And in Luther's two kingdom doctrine, though there is this Weltlich, this worldly, temporal, secular arena, it still was under God.
Yeah.
Yes.
God ruled over that kingdom in a different way than he rules over the church.
Well,
for
that's the
example,
point. That's
you know,
that's the
through
point
natural
of
law and reason and so on. But that, like Caleb, you're right. That the Italian Renaissance, art and architecture, and Platon, like there's this
And
huge. Well, I don't know
yeah.
if it's huge, but there's a revival of Platonic philosophy and like
And
this
Greek
Platonism
life,
that.
not
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
looking at Plato for insights into ethics and learning, but like literally emulation of ancient life in culture. That's the birth of modern secularism.
Oh, do you have a juicy example?
I mean, do you? You're obviously thinking of one.
Well, I think I might. I mean, I know there are like in terms of architecture, though, historians who focus on this sort of thing will illustrate how like their villas are start to be constructed in Italy, and all sorts of interesting things take place in these villas, including sexual things. And there's all sorts of experimentation, if you will,
the
with
purpose of some of the
things
island
outside the
villas.
norms.
Yeah, it's the purpose of some of the island villas because there was actually like a sexual sort of norm within Roman culture that people wanted outside of. Especially, we're talking. I mean, I'm sure it happened down on the lower levels of society too, but on the whole, you're talking about sort of like the aristocracy kind of level.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, one of the purpose of the island villas was to get out of Rome to go do crazy
Yeah.
stuff.
I mean,
Yep.
And where you
So
couldn't be
nobody
seen.
know.
Yeah.
Somebody know you'd be out away from the watchful eye of the
Yeah.
papal guard or whatever,
yeah. No, I mean, Dante is before Luther and is criticizing the church in many sections, and so
he puts popes in hell.
yeah,
The
it
same
wasn't
level as Muhammad, even,
right. Yeah,
which is
it's not,
outstanding.
but it wasn't new that people were challenging the authority of particular church institutions even yet.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
All right. I think we did that one. Did a good job on that one, if I do say so myself.
it was certainly an interesting one. I mean, I think we did. I don't want to pat ourselves on the back here, but there is a danger, right? Like, when you hear Christian podcasts do the secularism thing, I will say that it often becomes the case for the new crusade.
Yeah.
And so and we obviously, I don't want to completely bog on those people because we obviously have a lot in common with the way we think the world should be with other Christians who sort of mourn the death of these things. So I don't want to mog on them too harshly, but that's not really what we hope that the Thinking Fellows is as a podcast. So hopefully helpful and interesting to listeners. If you thought so, and if you're going to keep listening to the Thinking Fellows, we would love for you to become a subscriber to the show. You can subscribe for free in the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and a bunch of Podcast Addict and a bunch of other podcasting platforms. So you can find your favorite app and look up for the Thinking Fellows, and it will be free in all those apps to subscribe. You can also support the show by going to 1517.org/donate. And when you do that, you not only support the Thinking Fellows, but the rest of the projects at 1517.org. Thank you for listening. We will catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.